Hey folks, before the video starts, I want to say big thank you for the feedback you gave me in the last video. Again, I will be short and say, as every other video, to leave a like and hit the subscribe button. Also, don't forget to comment down below, helping me to give proof to YouTube that all of you who follow this channel so far are real people who watch my videos. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy. I found a dark web forum discussing Illuminati rituals. Last night, I woke up with their symbol burned into my skin. I'm not the kind of person who usually writes stuff like this. I don't post on Reddit, and I definitely don't believe in conspiracy theories. Or at least, I didn't. But after what happened last night, I don't even know what to think anymore. I just need to get this out, and maybe someone out there can help me make sense of it. So, a little background. I've always been curious about the internet's darker corners. You know, the deep web. Not because I'm looking for illegal stuff or anything. I just like the mystery of it. People talk about it like it's some forbidden realm where you can find the truth behind everything. Secret government files, hidden experiments, shadowy cabals. Most of it's probably fake, but I've always been curious. A few nights ago, I finally decided to see it for myself. I downloaded Tor, set up a VPN because I'm not stupid, and started exploring. At first, it was exactly what I expected. Boring forums, sketchy looking marketplaces, and links that didn't even work. Honestly, it felt like a waste of time. But then, I stumbled across a site that made me pause. It didn't have a name, just a series of symbols on a pitch black background, kind of like a mix between ancient runes and geometric shapes. I almost clicked away, but something about it, I don't know, it pulled me in. When I hovered over the symbols, they glitched slightly, like static on an old TV. And when I clicked one, it took me to a forum. The forum looked old, like something out of the early 2000s. There were no usernames, just timestamps and posts. The threads had titles like Ritual Locations Confirmed in Italy and How to Identify a True Initiate. It was all so absurd, I almost laughed, like something out of a bad thriller movie. But the weird thing was, the posts didn't read like fiction. They were written with this matter-of-fact tone, like the people posting were dead serious. One thread caught my eye. The marking process and its consequences. I clicked on it, and I swear, my heart skipped a beat. The post described a ritual where members of some group, the Illuminati, I guess, would leave a permanent mark on someone to signify they'd been chosen. It sounded ridiculous at first, but the comments were filled with photos. Grainy, low-res pictures of people with strange burns or scars on their skin, all shaped like the same symbol, a triangle with an eye in the center. I don't know why I kept reading. Maybe because part of me thought it was just some elaborate ARG or prank. The original poster claimed the marks weren't just symbols, they were like anchors. Once you were marked, you were connected to the group, whether you wanted to be or not. They could track you, influence you, even control you. I closed the site after that. It was too much, even for me. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those pictures. The way the burns looked so precise, so deliberate. And there was this one comment that kept running through my head. They choose the curious ones. I didn't think much of it at first. The whole thing felt like one of those late-night rabbit holes you end up down on the internet, where your curiosity spirals into some creepy, unsettling part of the web, and you go to bed thinking, That was weird. Glad I'm not part of that. But as the days went on, the unsettling feeling didn't go away. It lingered, like someone had whispered something just out of earshot, something that made you feel like you couldn't shake it, no matter how hard you tried. I kept checking my phone and my computer at random times, almost as if I was waiting for something. It wasn't normal. I knew that. I wasn't actively thinking about it, but my mind kept returning to those symbols and those posts, like the whole thing was trying to crawl its way back into my thoughts, little by little. The real kicker, though, came that night. I don't know if I was already half dreaming or if something was messing with my head, but when I closed my eyes, I found myself back on that dark website. The symbols, the cryptic posts, everything, except this time, it was different. It was like I wasn't just viewing the site. I was inside it. The screen in front of me wasn't some computer monitor. It was the world around me, dark and silent, and everything was flickering in and out like a broken neon sign. The strange part, I could hear the whispers again. They weren't from the forum. They were like voices coming from the walls, the air. It didn't make sense. They were muffled, but I could make out a few words. You've been chosen. We've seen you. It's already begun. I wanted to wake up, to shake myself out of whatever strange dream this was, but my body wouldn't respond. I could only stand there, paralyzed in place, as the voices grew louder, more frantic. They were coming from all directions, so close now that I could almost feel the pressure of their words against my skin. I could almost taste the static in the air, thick and suffocating. Then I saw it. The symbol, the triangle, with the eye in the center. It was glowing faintly, hovering in the air like it was waiting for something. I reached out without thinking. I had no control over my hand, but it moved forward anyway, as if drawn to the light. The moment my fingers touched the air where the symbol was floating, everything went black. I woke up with my heart pounding, like I'd been running a marathon in my sleep. My sheets were tangled around me, soaked with sweat. I pulled my phone out of sheer habit, thinking maybe the dream would make sense if I looked up something online. Anything. I didn't even bother checking the time. All I could focus on was the overwhelming feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I was clearly by myself in my bedroom. And that's when I saw it. On my forearm, there was a faint mark. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, or maybe a smudge of dirt. But when I moved my arm into the glow of my desk lamp, I froze. It was there. The symbol. A triangle with an eye in the center, just like the ones from the forum. It wasn't red, like a burn. It wasn't like a scar either. It was more like the pattern had been pressed into my skin, as though the symbol had been branded into me, without the heat or pain. It was pale at first, barely visible, but when I touched it, I could feel something, like a faint, almost imperceptible hum under my skin. It wasn't painful, but it was so wrong, like the skin there had been rearranged or manipulated in some way that my brain couldn't quite process. I tried to rub it off, thinking it was just some weird skin irritation, maybe something I'd picked up in the dream, but the mark didn't fade. If anything, it seemed to shimmer for a second, just out of sight, before it settled back into my skin, almost as if it had always been there. I remember sitting there, staring at it in complete disbelief. Was this some kind of prank? Had I really been that freaked out by the website that I was hallucinating? I didn't have any answers, but I knew something was very wrong. I spent the rest of the night searching for any explanation. I checked online to see if anyone else had experienced something like this, but the forums were full of people claiming they had been marked by the Illuminati or the Freemasons, or whatever they were calling it. No one seemed to explain what it meant or how it happened. It was just happening, over and over again. The problem? The more I searched, the more I found. There were others. People talking about symbols appearing on their skin. Others were saying they'd been marked in their dreams, only to wake up with the same symbol, sometimes on their hands, their necks, their faces. I felt the panic rising in my chest as I read post after post from people claiming to be connected to something bigger than they could understand. They'd get messages, phone calls, emails, or worse, they'd wake up in strange places, surrounded by unfamiliar faces, all wearing that same symbol. I tried to go to bed again, hoping it was just some stupid coincidence or sleep paralysis, but when I closed my eyes, the whispers came back. "You're part of us now." That was the last thing I heard before the buzzing in my ears drowned everything out. I woke up again, but this time, I wasn't alone. It's hard to explain the feeling of waking up and knowing something has changed. Like when you walk into a room and something's out of place, but you can't figure out what it is. That's what it felt like the moment my eyes fluttered open. It wasn't my bedroom. I was in a strange room. The walls were bare, the carpet cold beneath me, and the air had that sterile, almost metallic smell of a place that hadn't been used in years. The room was dim, lit only by the faint light of a single flickering bulb. Everything about it felt off. It wasn't just that the room was unfamiliar. It was the sense of isolation, the absence of any trace of life. I could hear nothing. No traffic outside. No sounds from the building. Nothing. I sat up quickly, heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming again, but this was different. This wasn't a dream. I was awake. I was here. My phone was beside me, still locked. I didn't even know how I got it, but it felt heavy in my hand as I unlocked it and checked the time. 3:48 a.m. I couldn't help but feel a jolt of panic. I should have been at home. I should have been in my own bed. I stood up and stumbled toward the door, but when I touched the handle, I hesitated. There was something wrong about the place. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was like everything in the room was waiting for me to open that door, like it knew I was going to. I didn't like the feeling, but I had no choice. I twisted the handle and stepped out into the hallway. The hallway was dark, with old wooden floors creaking underfoot. The air felt thick, like a heavy fog had settled in, and the faint hum of what sounded like a broken air conditioner buzzed in the background. But what struck me most was the quiet. It was too quiet. It was the kind of silence that fills your ears and makes everything feel amplified, like your own heartbeat is the only thing keeping the world from collapsing in on itself. I started walking, trying to get a sense of where I was, but after a few steps, I froze. There, in front of me, was a door. It looked normal enough, just a plain wooden door, nothing special about it. But what made my blood run cold was the symbol that was carved into it, the same triangle, the same eye in the center. It was unmistakable. It was the same mark that had appeared on my arm, and it was alive. The lines of the symbol seemed to pulse faintly, like it was breathing. I don't know why I did it. I should have turned around, run in the other direction, but something pulled me toward the door. My hand reached out again, this time with more purpose, and when I touched the wood, I could feel it, the pulse, like the door was alive, like it was waiting for me. Without thinking, I turned the handle and pushed it open. The room behind the door was even stranger. It wasn't a typical room at all. It looked more like a library crossed with an old church. The walls were lined with shelves filled with dusty, leather-bound books, and the air smelled of age, like something hadn't been touched in decades. But what made my stomach churn was the altar at the far end of the room. I don't know how to explain it. There was nothing overtly threatening about it. It was just an altar, like the kind you might see in a historical documentary. But the moment I looked at it, I felt sick. The light in the room seemed to bend around it, like everything was drawn to the altar in the same way the door had pulled me in. Then I noticed something even worse. In front of the altar, kneeling on the floor, was a figure. A person, their back to me. I couldn't see their face, but they were hunched over, motionless, as though they were waiting for me. My mind raced. This wasn't just some weird dream. This wasn't some ARG or creepy past that I'd stumbled across. This was real. And whoever was in that room, whatever was happening here, I was involved in it now. I had no idea how, but somehow the person in front of the altar knew I was there. They slowly turned their head, and when I saw their face, I nearly screamed. Their face was blank. There were no eyes, no mouth, just smooth, featureless skin. It was like someone had taken a face and erased it completely, leaving only a void where their identity should have been. The figure stood up slowly, still facing me. There was no movement in their body, just a slow, deliberate shift toward me. Then, in the same monotone voice that had whispered in my ear earlier, the figure said, "You've been chosen." I felt my chest tighten. My whole body felt frozen. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The person stepped closer, and with every step, I felt like the air around me was growing colder. The skin on my arms prickled. My heartbeat was so loud, it drowned out everything else. But even that felt wrong. Like it wasn't my heartbeat at all. Like it was being forced into my chest. "You were curious," the figure said, its voice like sandpaper scraping against glass. "You shouldn't have looked. But now you will understand." My legs finally gave out, and I fell to my knees, the room spinning around me. The symbol on the door, the symbol on my arm, it wasn't just a mark. It was a call, a signal that had brought me here. And now, it was too late to back out. Too late to undo the damage. As I looked up, desperate for some way to escape, I saw the figure hold up something in their hand. A small black stone. It was smooth, polished, with a strange gleam that made it seem alive in its own way. "Do you understand now?" the figure whispered. Before I could answer, the stone glowed, and the world around me shattered. I tried to convince myself that what happened wasn't real. I spent hours pacing around my apartment, telling myself I'd just had a bad night, that it was a stress-induced hallucination or some weird side effect from staying up too late. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I could feel it, like the air had shifted somehow. It wasn't just the symbol anymore. It was everything. The way the world felt different now, as though it was being watched, pulled taut by invisible threads. That night, I locked every door and double-checked the windows. I even put my phone on Do Not Disturb, hoping the silence would calm me down. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It felt like a presence in the room, just out of sight, lingering at the edge of my consciousness, waiting for me to turn around. I kept my eyes fixed on the ceiling, praying that whatever it was, it would leave me alone. Then, just before I fell into a restless sleep, I heard it, a faint tapping, like something light and rhythmic, coming from the corner of my room. My heart froze. I didn't move. I couldn't. The tapping grew louder, more deliberate. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what it was. It wasn't just tapping. It was scratching, soft, slow, like nails dragging across the wall. And it was coming closer. I turned my head, just a little, enough to catch a glimpse of the darkness in the corner of the room. At first, I thought it was just the shadows, but as I focused, I saw them. Figures, 3 of them, standing still, motionless, blending into the darkness like they were part of the very room itself. Their bodies were hard to make out, like smudges in the low light, but there was something about them that made my skin crawl. They were wrong. Their shapes didn't follow the contours of the room, as though they were shifting, moving without moving, if that makes sense. Like shadows that were somehow out of place in the reality around them. I wanted to scream. I wanted to jump up and run, but my body was paralyzed. I couldn't move. I could barely breathe. One of them stepped forward, so slowly, like it was calculating every movement. The other 2 remained where they were, staring at me. Or at least, I think they were staring. Their faces were featureless, just black voids, but I felt their eyes on me, heavy and penetrating. The closer the figure came, the more I could feel its presence pressing against me. My heart pounded so loud, I thought it would shatter my ribs. I had to blink. I had to look away, but I couldn't. It was like the figure had anchored itself into my vision, pulling me in. I could hear it now, not with my ears, but with my mind. The same whispers from my dream, the same voices that had been speaking in the forum, now spoken out loud, filling the air. "You've been chosen," they said. It wasn't one voice, but many, overlapping, as though hundreds of people were speaking through that one figure. "You belong to us now." I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. My mouth was dry, my tongue thick and useless in my mouth. I closed my eyes, hoping, praying, that it would end, but the figure was right there, too close now, its presence almost tangible. I could feel its coldness, like ice on my skin. "Look at us," it whispered, and I felt the pressure, the command of those words deep in my chest. I couldn't resist. My eyes snapped open, and there it was, the symbol, burned into its chest, the same exact mark that was on my skin. I gasped, but the sound caught in my throat. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, a dark silhouette in the corner, staring back at me, like it was waiting for something. I felt a sharp jolt of fear, an instinct to flee, but I was rooted to the bed, paralyzed by something much stronger than fear. It was like the presence of this thing was a tether, pulling me deeper into something I couldn't escape. The figure raised its hand, a long, unnaturally paw finger, pointing directly at me. I could see it now, clearly. Its finger, long and too thin, ending in a claw that looked wrong, like it wasn't supposed to exist. It moved so slowly, so deliberately, as it pointed at my chest, just above my heart. My breath hitched, and that's when I noticed it. The mark, the symbol. It was glowing. It wasn't just some faded burn anymore. It was pulsating, faintly at first, then brighter, like it was alive, throbbing under my skin. And then the air went cold, so cold that I could see my breath, visible in the dark room. like I was standing in front of an open freezer. The room felt wrong, heavy, like the walls were closing in around me. The figure didn't move, but the other two behind it stepped forward, slowly. Their bodies seemed to distort with each step, like they were becoming more real, becoming more solid. I wanted to turn away. I wanted to run. I needed to escape. But my eyes were locked onto the symbol on the figure's chest. I couldn't stop looking at it. Then the whisper came again, louder this time, almost thundering in my head. You are one of us now. You cannot leave. And that's when the real panic hit me. I didn't just feel trapped by the room. I felt like I was trapped in my own skin, like the symbol wasn't just on the surface, but had burrowed into me, deep, embedding itself in my soul, in my very existence. The figure's hand dropped slowly, and the other two figures stood silent, like they were waiting for something. I didn't know what they were waiting for, but I knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. I closed my eyes, trying to force myself awake, but I couldn't escape. I wasn't in my bed anymore. I was somewhere else, somewhere darker. I could feel it, the weight of their presence, pressing down on me, suffocating me. Then the room went completely black. I don't know how long I was in the dark. It could have been seconds, or hours, or even days. It didn't matter anymore. Time felt warped, as if it had stopped entirely the moment those figures stepped into my room. I felt like I was floating in a void, suspended between sleep and waking, unable to move or escape. The darkness was thick, smothering, like I was drowning in it, suffocated by the weight of what was happening. Then there was a sound, not the whispers anymore. Number. This was different. A low, rumbling hum, vibrating through my bones. It felt like it was coming from inside the walls themselves, a frequency I couldn't escape. It was everywhere. The temperature dropped. I felt my breath catch in my throat, but it wasn't just the cold. It was like the air itself had changed. It had become dense, thick with something else, something unnatural. I felt my skin crawl, my whole body tense with a primal, desperate need to get out. And then, the eyes. I don't know how I saw them at first. Maybe they were always there, but I couldn't make them out until now. At first, I thought they were just shadows or reflections from the dark. But no, I saw them. The walls, they weren't walls anymore. The surface of the walls had shifted, stretched in places, almost like the fabric of reality itself had been torn open. Through the rifts, I saw them. Eyes, hundreds of them, all staring at me. They weren't human eyes. They didn't have pupils or irises. They were just vast, dark voids, swirling with an endless abyss. It was like the eyes weren't looking at me. They were looking through me, tearing through the layers of my being, as if they could see my thoughts, my memories, everything I'd ever been. Each one was connected by thin, veiny lines of light that stretched across the walls, winding like veins under the skin of the room, tracing paths in the dark. The eyes blinked at their own pace, some fast, others slow, but they were all watching me, waiting. I couldn't tear my eyes away from them. The more I looked, the more they moved, crawling like bugs under my skin, following me, tracking every twitch of my body. It was as if they were feeding on my fear, pulling me deeper into their gaze, dragging me into something I couldn't understand. Suddenly, I felt the pressure in my chest again, the same feeling from before, when the figures had pointed at me, when their whispers filled the air. The room constricted, my lungs burned, and the symbol on my arm, on my chest, on my back, all over, flared to life again. It wasn't just glowing anymore. It was spreading. I could feel the skin pulling tight, like the symbol was being etched into my body, deeper than skin, deeper than flesh. It felt like it was burning into me, not with heat, but with a cold, consuming force, until every inch of my body felt like it was branded with that impossible mark. The eyes, the hundreds of eyes, all focused on me now, and the whispers came again, louder, like they were screaming in my ears, but they weren't just in my head anymore. They were real. I could hear them as if they were coming from behind me, around me, inside me. You belong to us now. You cannot run. You will never be free. The words weren't in a language I recognized. They were sharp, harsh, guttural, like they were scraping the inside of my skull, echoing off the walls. They hurt, and they didn't stop. They just kept coming, faster now, overlapping, twisting together into a cacophony of voices that I couldn't escape. And then I saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, not one of the three that had been in my room before, but something different. Its body was tall, thin, and covered in dark, shifting shapes, like a human silhouette filled with ink-black smoke. The symbol was branded across its chest, but this one was not just glowing. It was alive, swirling with light, like it was breathing. The figure reached out to me, its hand long and elongated, its fingers like claws that seemed to stretch the closer they got. The darkness around it seemed to grow thicker, and the room began to bend again, the walls warping, twisting, as if they were no longer real. I felt my body respond. My body wasn't mine anymore. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I was being pulled toward the figure, dragged into the abyss of its gaze, into the center of those eyes that burned into me. I felt cold, so cold. I thought I was going to freeze right there, but then a single voice cut through the chaos. One voice, sharp and clear, louder than all the others. It's time. I don't know if I screamed. I don't even know if I moved. But I felt it. The moment when everything went black. The moment when I knew I was no longer in my room. No longer in my body. I woke up again. But this time, I wasn't alone. My skin was different. The mark was gone. But the feeling, the presence, was still there. Inside me. In my mind. I could feel them, watching me. Every second, every breath, they were there. I glanced in the mirror, expecting to see my usual reflection. But instead, I saw it. The symbol was back. It was on my face, on my hands, etched across my eyes. I knew then that I wasn't just part of this. I was theirs, and they were always going to be with me. I wasn't going to wake up again. Not this time. The whispers returned. They filled the room, filled my mind, filled everything. And this time, I listened, because I knew it was the truth. You've been chosen, and I would never escape. I was hired through the dark web to guard a Freemason lodge. The basement holds something that's still alive. Alright, so I wasn't going to post this. I mean, who's going to believe me? But it's been eating at me for weeks. Every time I close my eyes, I see it. And the worst part? I'm starting to think it might still be out there. Let me back up. A little about me. I'm one of those people who stumbled into a life they didn't really plan for. My parents thought I'd end up in college with a real career. But, you know, life happens. I dropped out after a semester and started bouncing between dead-end jobs, bartending, warehouse shifts, late night security gigs, whatever paid the bills. But one night, after another miserable shift guarding an empty office building, I found myself scrolling the internet at 3 a.m. That's when I made my first mistake, going on the deep web. It started innocent enough. Just curiosity, you know. I wasn't looking for anything shady, just poking around forums, reading threads about conspiracy theories and random junk. Then I saw it, a job posting. The title was, "Discreet Night Guard Needed, High Pay." The post wasn't long, just a couple of vague details. Looking for someone reliable to guard a private property for 3 nights. $500 a night. Must be discreet. There was an email address, but no name, no location, nothing specific. $500 a night. That's more than I made in a week at my usual gigs. And yeah, I know what you're thinking. Red flag, right? But I was broke. Like ramen for breakfast and dinner broke. And it sounded easy. I figured it was probably just some rich guy paranoid about his mansion or something. So, I replied. The next day, I got an email back. They didn't ask for much, just my name and a phone number. About an hour after I sent it, my phone buzzed. The guy on the other end had this deep, almost monotone voice. He told me to meet him in a parking lot at 10 p.m. for an interview. No other details. Most people would have bailed, but again, $500 a night. I showed up a little before 10. The parking lot was behind some dingy strip mall, and there was this black SUV parked under one of the flickering streetlights. The guy inside rolled the window down as I approached. He was wearing a suit, like full-on Men in Black vibes, and his face was half shadowed by the dim light. I couldn't see much except for a sharp jawline and these cold, calculating eyes. "You're here for the job?" he asked. I nodded. "Do you scare easily?" I laughed, more to break the tension than anything. "Not really." He didn't smile. He just nodded, reached into the passenger seat, and handed me a folded piece of paper. "The address is on there. Show up at 11 p.m. sharp. Don't bring anyone. Don't tell anyone. If you don't show, you won't hear from us again." The address turned out to be a Freemason lodge in the middle of nowhere. I didn't even know those were still a thing. The building was old, like something out of a gothic horror movie. It had tall, narrow windows and these weird carvings around the entrance. Symbols I couldn't make sense of, like stars and compasses. There was a single light above the door, flickering like it was about to die. I almost turned around right there, but then I remembered the cash. 3 nights. That's all I had to get through. I knocked, and the door creaked open almost immediately. Another guy in a suit stood there, but this one looked older, maybe mid-50s. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, and he smelled faintly of mothballs. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. The inside was even creepier than the outside. The walls were lined with these old wooden panels, and there were framed portraits of men in robes and sashes. Some of them were so old, the paint was peeling off. In the center of the room was a spiral staircase leading down. "You'll be guarding the basement," the man said, his voice flat. What's in the basement?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he handed me a flashlight and a set of keys. "Stay upstairs. Check the doors and windows every hour. Do not go into the basement under any circumstances. Understood?" I nodded, but inside I was starting to feel that gnawing sense of dread. Something was definitely off. The first night was uneventful. Mostly. I did as I was told. Checked the doors, shone my flashlight around the perimeter, and tried not to think about the fact that I was alone in a Freemason lodge in the middle of nowhere. But around 2 a.m., I heard it. A thud. It came from below me, like something heavy being dropped on concrete. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. I thought about calling the guy who hired me, but I didn't even have a number, just that email address. Another thud. This one was louder. Against my better judgment, I crept toward the staircase. The door to the basement was closed, but I could see the faint glow of a light shining through the cracks. I pressed my ear to the wood and held my breath. That's when I heard it. A low, wet, gurgling sound, like someone struggling to breathe. It was faint, but unmistakable. I bolted back to the main hall and sat there until morning, clutching the flashlight like it was the only thing keeping me alive. When the guy in the suit showed up at 7 a.m., I didn't even mention it. Something told me he already knew. By the time the second night rolled around, I thought I had it figured out. The first night was probably just my imagination running wild. Nothing more than an old building creaking in the wind, right? I mean, it wasn't like anything had really happened. I showed up a little early, hoping to get a head start, and walked around the property again just to check everything was locked up tight. The sun was setting, casting this eerie orange light across the lodge that made the carvings on the walls look almost alive. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it wasn't easy. There was something about the place that gnawed at you, like it was watching you from the shadows. When I stepped inside, the old man was already there, waiting by the front door. His face, like the first time, was pale and unshaven, but tonight something was different. He looked agitated. He barely said a word as he handed me the keys and the flashlight again. His eyes kept flicking toward the basement door, like he was afraid of it. "You know the rules," he muttered. "Don't go down there. Don't even think about it." He didn't wait for me to respond, just turned on his heel and disappeared into the back of the building. I had the feeling I wouldn't see him again until morning. The night was colder, the kind of chill that cuts right through you. I did my rounds, checking the windows and making sure everything was locked. The quiet was oppressive, like the lodge itself was holding its breath. Every little sound echoed, even the creak of the floorboards under my boots. Around midnight, I was standing in front of the basement door, flashlight in hand, when I heard something. Not a thud this time, but something worse. A scratching, like fingernails scraping against stone. I stood frozen for a few seconds, listening. It was faint at first, almost like it was coming from behind the door. But the longer I stood there, the clearer it became. It was rhythmic, like someone or something was trying to claw its way out. I swear, I could feel my heart pounding in my throat. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but I knew that would be a huge mistake. What if the guy who hired me found out? What if he did something worse? The thought of crossing that line felt terrifying. So I stayed there, just listening to the scratching until it stopped as suddenly as it had started. That's when I did something stupid. I checked the basement door. The door was cold to the touch, the metal handle heavy in my hand. For a second, I just stared at it. The silence around me seemed to stretch for miles, and the air felt thicker, like it was pressing in on me from all sides. Then I turned the handle. It opened, just a little. I don't know what I expected to find. Maybe just a dusty old storage room, maybe a broken pipe, or some weird piece of equipment. But when the door cracked open, the first thing that hit me wasn't dust. It was the smell. It wasn't like mold or stale air. It was something worse, something sickly sweet and sour, something that made my stomach churn and my throat tighten. The smell was coming from below, like it had soaked into the walls. I stepped back, almost stumbling, and snapped the door shut. What the hell was that? I didn't know what to do. I should have gone upstairs and called it a night, but something kept me rooted to the spot. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was that stupid feeling of needing to be in control. I looked at the staircase leading down, the basement, and for a second, just a second, I almost wanted to go down there. But I didn't. I went back to the main hall and sat down, trying to calm myself. I thought maybe I was just overthinking it, that I was just tired from the night before, and that I needed some sleep. I didn't get any. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again, the scratching. But this time, it was different. It was louder, more frantic, and it sounded like it was getting closer. I grabbed the flashlight and rushed over to the basement door, my heart hammering. But as I stood there, I realized something. I couldn't hear the scratching anymore. Instead, there was this low, guttural noise, almost like a growl. I'm not going to lie. I froze. My body went cold, like I was suddenly standing in the middle of a frozen lake, and it was cracking under my feet. For a long time, I stood there, just listening. The growl was quiet at first, like a whisper, but the longer I stood there, the louder it became. It sounded like it was coming from the deepest part of the basement. I shouldn't have gone down there. I know that now, but I did. I don't know what possessed me, but I grabbed the keys and opened the door again, this time pushing it all the way open. The staircase was bathed in the dim glow of my flashlight, the steps leading down into darkness. With my heart in my throat, I started to descend. The air was thicker down here, suffocating, and the smell was even worse. It was stronger, more intense, like it was coming from something alive down there. Something wrong. I reached the bottom of the stairs, and that's when I saw it. At first, it was just a shape in the shadows, something long and twisted, but as my flashlight flickered, I saw it clearer. There was something in the corner of the basement. It wasn't human, at least I don't think it was. It was hunched over, its body covered in dark, matted hair, and its face was wrong. The features weren't even remotely human. Its eyes were wide, unblinking, like glass beads. Its mouth opened, revealing jagged teeth that were too long for anything natural. It didn't move at first. It just stared at me. But then, with a slow, agonizing movement, it lifted its arm, if you could call it that, and scraped its nails against the concrete floor. The sound was the same one I'd been hearing all night. That's when I realized the horrible truth. Whatever it wasn't supposed to be down there. I backed up, heart racing, but before I could turn to run, I heard the door behind me creak shut. Someone had locked me in. Panic hit me like a sledgehammer, and for a second, I didn't know what to do. My breath was ragged, shallow. I felt my chest tightening, like the walls themselves were closing in on me. That thing in the corner, whatever it was still watching me, its dark eyes fixed on mine, and it hadn't moved an inch since I noticed it. But the real horror, the real terror, was that I couldn't move either. My legs were frozen. The darkness of the basement seemed to pull me deeper with every passing second, as if it had a hold on me, wrapping its cold fingers around my body, my mind. I heard the door click behind me. The lock. Someone had locked it. I turned around, frantic, and tried to push it open, but it was no use. The door wouldn't budge. It was then that I realized I was trapped. I could still hear the scratching. It was coming from every direction now, echoing off the walls, bouncing around the basement like it was inside my head. My flashlight flickered and buzzed in my hand, the beam growing weaker as I gripped it tighter. But it didn't matter. The light didn't help anymore. I looked back at the creature in the corner. It hadn't moved a muscle, but I could feel it now. It was alive, and it was aware of me. I backed away slowly, trying to stay calm, trying not to make any noise. But every step I took seemed to make the basement grow darker, colder. The shadows seemed to lengthen, stretching toward me like fingers, hungry fingers, eager to pull me into the abyss. And then I heard it, a soft whisper, almost imperceptible. At first, I thought it was in my head. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe I was hearing things. But then it came again, louder this time. "Help me." The voice was faint, cracked, and raspy, like it hadn't spoken in years. It was almost impossible to tell where it was coming from, but I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't coming from the creature. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the door, but the whispering continued, each word heavier than the last. "Please, help me." My mind raced. I knew I needed to get out. The only way was up the stairs, but that meant getting past the thing in the corner, getting past whatever it was that was waiting for me. I had to think. I had to make a plan. I couldn't see the stairs. I couldn't see anything except the small beam of light coming from my dying flashlight. But I could hear the thing now. It was moving, not toward me, but shifting, rustling, like it was preparing for something. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and slowly began to back toward the stairs, one step at a time, my legs shaking uncontrollably. The whispering grew louder, more frantic now, but I didn't dare turn around to look at it. I could feel its eyes on me, watching. The air in the basement was thick, suffocating. It felt like the walls were breathing, like the very foundation of the building was alive, exhaling hot, fetid air. The stench from the creature. It wasn't just the smell of decay anymore. It was something worse, like a rotting carcass combined with something living, something that should have died but hadn't. I reached the bottom of the stairs, my hand brushing against the cold stone wall as I tried to make my way up. And that's when I heard it. A soft thud, a heavy footstep, and then another. The thing in the corner was standing. It was slowly rising to its feet. Its limbs cracked and groaned as if they hadn't moved in decades. And the scraping sound, the scratching I'd heard, came from its fingers dragging against the concrete floor. I couldn't see it clearly in the darkness, but I knew it was coming toward me. Every part of me screamed to run, but I couldn't. My body refused to cooperate. My legs were like jelly, and my feet felt glued to the floor. "Help me." The whisper came again, this time louder, closer, almost as if it was coming from inside my head. It was unbearable. I had no choice. I had to move. I lunged toward the stairs, stumbling up them, my hands gripping the railing, my pulse pounding in my ears. My flashlight flickered, then went out completely. The basement was completely dark now. I couldn't see anything. I didn't even know if the thing was still following me, but I could feel it. Its presence, the suffocating weight of it. It was like a shadow wrapping around me, pushing me forward, urging me to run. I reached the top of the stairs, slamming my shoulder into the basement door. It didn't open. I pushed again, harder this time, my palms slick with sweat. I had to get out. I had to. The door opened. I didn't even think. I bolted. I didn't look back. My heart was racing as I ran through the hallways, past the portraits, past the old wooden panels. The lodge felt like it was stretching, like it was never ending. The shadows were closing in on me. The walls seemed to close in with each step I took, but I didn't care. I had to get out. When I reached the front door, I yanked it open with everything I had. I didn't look behind me. I ran outside into the cold night, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The air felt like ice on my lungs, but I didn't stop. I kept running, not caring where I was going, not caring how far I had to go. I just needed to get away from that place. I didn't stop until I was back at my car. I slammed the door behind me, and for the first time that night, I felt a sliver of relief. I was out. I was safe, but I wasn't free. When I got home, I collapsed on the couch, trying to catch my breath. My hands were shaking, my heart still thumping in my chest. The smell of the basement, the rot, the decay, the sickeningly sweet stench was still in my nose, like it had followed me home. I tried to forget about it. I tried to tell myself it was over, that it was just some freak accident, that I was just imagining things. But then the email came. It was from the same address as the original posting. "You've seen it now." That's all it said. No signature, no explanation. I didn't have to read anymore. I shut the laptop and stared at the screen. I don't know what they were keeping down there, but whatever it was, it's still alive. And now, it knows me. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing. Its twisted, hunched form, the way its limbs cracked as it moved, and those eyes, those black, glassy eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. But it wasn't just the memories that kept me awake. It was the feeling that something wasn't right. Even in the safety of my tiny apartment, I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. The email, "You've seen it now." I couldn't stop thinking about those words. What did they mean? Why would they send that to me? Were they threatening me? Or was it something worse? I was still sitting on the couch, staring at the laptop, when my phone buzzed. The screen lit up with an unknown number. For a moment, I thought about ignoring it, but something compelled me to pick it up. Maybe it was the faint hope that it would be some kind of explanation, some kind of closure. I answered. "Hello?" Nothing, just static. "Who is this?" I said, my voice cracking. And then I heard it, a faint whisper, distorted through the static. "You shouldn't have looked." My blood ran cold. I hung up immediately, my hand trembling as I set the phone down on the coffee table. My heart was racing, my mind spinning. This couldn't be happening. Maybe it was just a prank. Maybe they were just trying to scare me. But the voice, it was too familiar. It was the same one I'd heard in the basement. The next few days passed in a blur of paranoia. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Every little sound set me on edge. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint rustle of leaves outside my window. I started keeping all the lights on, even during the day, and I barricaded my front door with a chair at night. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't just paranoia. I started noticing things, little things at first, like the way my bedroom window seemed to creak open on its own, or the faint smell of that sickly sweet rot that seemed to linger no matter how many times I scrubbed the floors. And then there were the shadows. The first time I saw it was late at night, maybe 2 or 3 a.m. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A shape, darker than the rest of the room. moving along the far wall. I shot up, grabbing the flashlight I kept on my nightstand, and shone it toward the corner. Nothing. Just an empty wall. But the feeling didn't go away. That sense of being watched. It was almost tangible, like a weight pressing down on my chest. The next time was worse. I was in the kitchen, pouring myself a cup of coffee, when I saw it again, this time in the reflection of the microwave door. A figure standing just behind me. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but again there was nothing there. Nothing, except for the smell, that god-awful stench. The next night, I decided I couldn't stay in the apartment anymore. I packed a bag and drove to a cheap motel on the edge of town. It wasn't much, a dingy little place with peeling wallpaper and a flickering neon sign, but it felt safer than my own home. At least it did at first. I spent most of the night sitting on the bed, flipping through channels on the old tube TV, trying to distract myself. But no matter what I watched, I couldn't focus. My mind kept wandering back to the lodge, to the basement, to the thing that had been waiting for me in the darkness. Around midnight, I heard it. A knock at the door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I froze, the remote slipping from my hand. The sound wasn't loud. It was almost polite, but it sent a chill down my spine. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer. I got up slowly, my legs feeling like they were made of lead, and crept toward the door. I peered through the peephole, expecting to see nothing, but there was something. A figure standing just outside the door. It was tall, its body hunched, and its face was obscured by the shadows. But I could see its eyes, those same black, glassy eyes I'd seen in the basement. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The knocking came again, louder this time, more insistent. I grabbed the chair from the corner of the room and wedged it under the doorknob, backing away until I was pressed against the far wall. The knocking stopped. For a moment, there was silence. And then, I heard it. "Let me in." The voice was faint, muffled by the door, but it was the same whisper, the same cracked, rasping tone. I covered my ears, squeezing my eyes shut. "Go away," I screamed. When I opened my eyes, the room was empty. No shadows, no figure, no sound, just the faint hum of the TV. But I knew better. It wasn't gone. It was waiting. The next morning, I checked out of the motel and went straight to the police. I told them everything about the job, the lodge, the thing in the basement. I left out the part about the emails and the knocking. I didn't want them to think I was crazy. The officer behind the desk listened patiently, but I could tell he didn't believe me. He nodded, took a few notes, and told me he'd look into it. But as I was leaving, I heard him mutter something under his breath to his partner. Another one of those Mason freakouts. That night, I drove past the lodge, just to see if it was still there. It was. The building looked the same as it had the first night I arrived. Old, imposing, and eerily quiet. But as I sat there in my car, staring at the entrance, I noticed something strange. The door was open, just a crack, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the doorway, watching me. I didn't stick around to find out. I hit the gas and didn't stop until I was back in town. But as I write this, sitting here in the dark, I can't shake the feeling that I brought something back with me. Something from the basement. Something that isn't supposed to exist. I thought I could escape it. I really did. The more I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, the more I realized I was lying. The whispers hadn't stopped. The shadows were still there. lurking at the edge of my vision, never fully in the light. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. No, watching me. The paranoia was suffocating, but I couldn't put my finger on what was real anymore. It had been almost a week since I left the lodge. I hadn't returned. I didn't want to. I didn't know what I would find if I went back. But every night, when I lay down to sleep, I heard the faint rustle of movement from the corner of the room, the low groan of the floorboards beneath something or someone moving. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, but it was always the same. Every night, the same rhythm, the same cold draft in the room, despite the windows being shut. It wasn't just the apartment. It was everywhere. I tried to distract myself, taking long drives, visiting friends, even staying in different motels. But the feeling never left. The shadows would follow me, creeping into every room I entered, curling up in the corners, stretching behind me like they were waiting to pounce. I couldn't even escape it online. The emails started coming again, but this time they were different. I didn't recognize the address at first. It was a long string of random letters and numbers, but the message was unmistakable. "We know what you saw." That was it. Just those 4 words. It hit me harder than the first email. They were getting closer. They were watching me. I tried to block the email address, delete my accounts, but they kept coming. Each one darker than the last. More personal. They started describing things they shouldn't know. Things I'd never told anyone. The shape in the corner of my room. The smell. The way the door had creaked open at the motel. The feeling of someone, something, just behind me. It felt like they were watching me through the screen. They knew my every move. I couldn't tell if it was the same group of people who had hired me, or if it was something else, something darker. But I didn't care. I just needed it to stop. I needed to be left alone. That's when the phone call started. It was the dead of night, like always. My apartment was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling again, when the phone rang. The ringtone was jarring, breaking the silence. I looked at the screen. Unknown number. For a second, I thought about ignoring it, but something made me answer. I don't know what it was, some twisted curiosity, or maybe just the desperate need for answers. "Hello?" Silence. Just static. I should have hung up. I knew I should have. But the thing on the other end of the line seemed to pull me in. The whispering started. The same voice. The one I'd heard in the basement. But this time, it wasn't distorted by static. It was clear. Too clear. "I'm still here." I slammed the phone down. My hands were shaking so violently, I could barely hold it. My heart was pounding. I tried to tell myself it was a prank, someone messing with me. Maybe it was a coincidence, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I knew I hadn't escaped. The next morning, the knocking started again. Not on the door. This time, it came from the walls. It wasn't random. It was rhythmic, like it was trying to communicate with me, trying to get my attention. 3 knocks, a pause, then 2 more, then another pause. Over and over again, it echoed through the apartment, vibrating the very foundation of the building. My mind was screaming, "Get out!" I grabbed my things, my wallet, my jacket, and fled. I didn't even care about the door. I didn't care who saw me. I just needed to get out. I drove aimlessly, my hands tight on the wheel, my heart in my throat. My car felt like a cage, the walls closing in around me. Everywhere I went, I could feel the darkness creeping in. The thing from the lodge had followed me. It was real, and it was here. I didn't stop driving until I ended up back at the lodge. I don't know what possessed me to go there. Maybe I thought I could confront it, figure out what the hell was really happening. But as I stood in front of the towering building, I knew there was no going back. The door stood ajar, just like I had seen that night, just like it had been in my dreams. The air was thick, saturated with the same smell I'd grown used to. The decay, the rot. It wasn't just the building. It was something inside it. I could feel it in my bones. I stepped through the door, my breath shallow, my steps heavy. The place felt colder than it had before. And the silence. It was so thick, it felt like it had weight, like it was suffocating me. The whispers were louder now, reverberating through the walls. They were in my head. They were everywhere. Help me! The voice was clearer now, more desperate, more urgent. I followed the whispers, down the dark corridors, my flashlight flickering in my trembling hand. The walls seemed to close in on me as I walked. Each step seemed to take me deeper into the lodge, further into its heart. I couldn't see the shadows, but I could feel them all around me, pressing, curling around my feet like something trying to drag me down. I reached the basement door. It was the same as before. Old, rusted, heavy. But this time, I didn't hesitate. I didn't think twice. I opened it, and there it was, the thing. It was standing in the corner, exactly where it had been the first time I saw it. But now, its body was moving, jerking, twitching in a grotesque imitation of life. Its limbs were contorted, pulled out of place. But the worst part, its eyes. Those eyes. They were fixed on me, watching. And then I heard the voice again, louder this time. Help me. It wasn't the same voice I'd heard before. This was different. It was human. I realized with horror what had happened. This thing in the corner wasn't alive in the way I thought. It was something else. Something that had been trapped here, alive, but only just. It had been waiting for someone like me. I tried to step back, but the door slammed shut behind me, and the darkness swallowed me whole. To this day, I still don't know if I escaped, or if I'm still trapped in that basement. But I know one thing for sure. It's still watching me, and it's still waiting. The eyes in the dark never stop watching. A serial killer known as the Laughing Man leaves audio recordings of his victims begging for mercy. I found one of those tapes in my car. It started like any other boring evening. A normal Friday night, me sitting in my car, scrolling aimlessly through my phone, waiting for the last few minutes of my shift to pass. I work as a delivery driver for a local restaurant. Nothing special, just a quiet job that keeps me on my feet. I had just dropped off an order on the outskirts of the city and was heading back when I noticed something strange in the passenger seat. There was a tape, an old cassette tape lying there, right where my seatbelt buckle should have been. I didn't recognize it at first. Honestly, I couldn't remember the last time I even saw a cassette tape, let alone used one. I stared at it for a second, unsure how it got there. I thought maybe one of my friends had left it behind, but then I remembered that I hadn't seen any of them in weeks. I reached over and picked it up. It was a basic tape, no label, just black, with a thin sliver of silver, where the writing would usually go. No markings, no clues. I tossed it back onto the seat and kept driving, not really thinking about it, but I couldn't ignore the odd feeling in my gut. Something was off about it. Why had it just shown up? Why now, of all times? I pulled into the parking lot of the restaurant, grabbed the order bags, and went inside to drop them off. By the time I came back out, the tape was still there, sitting on the passenger seat. I debated for a second, but I decided to take it with me. I had no idea why, but my curiosity was getting the best of me. When I got home, I set the tape on my desk. I didn't have a cassette player, but I figured I'd pop it in tomorrow, just for the hell of it. Part of me wanted to just throw it out. Something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong, but I didn't. I left it there, staring at me with its empty black face. That night, as I was lying in bed, I heard something, a muffled sound, like a low buzzing from somewhere in my apartment. I tried to ignore it, but it persisted, and I realized it was coming from the desk. I got up, confused, and walked over to the desk. The tape was no longer just sitting there. It was playing. I didn't have a cassette player. I didn't even own one. I felt my heart race. My body froze. For a second, I thought maybe I was imagining it, but when I picked it up, I heard something else. A voice. It was faint at first, too quiet to make out, but then the voice grew louder, clearer, and I could swear I heard something else too. A low, mocking laugh. A sound so chilling, so unnatural, it felt like it was crawling inside my skin. I pulled the tape from the player, but the laugh didn't stop. It echoed in my mind, filling the room like a distant hum. The voice, too, became clearer. Help me. Please. It was a woman's voice, but it wasn't just pleading. It was terrified, desperate, begging. I dropped the tape on the floor, my heart pounding in my chest. It felt like I had just crossed some invisible line. My hand was shaking as I picked it up again, staring at it. The silence was deafening now. The only sound, the thudding of my heartbeat in my ears. I stared at it for what felt like hours. I should have thrown it away. I should have burned it, thrown it into the river, smashed it into pieces. But instead, I popped it back into the cassette player, and I listened. This time, the voice wasn't faint anymore. I can hear you. I can hear your heartbeat. You're next. The voice was unmistakable now, cold and cruel. It was followed by that same laugh, low, guttural, like it came from deep in the chest of something monstrous. I felt the cold crawl up my spine. I had to stop listening. I wanted to turn it off, but something wouldn't let me. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was fear, but I couldn't stop. And then I heard something else. The sound of something shifting, moving, like a body struggling, trying to get free. Please, I don't want to die. I jumped out of my chair, pulling the headphones from my ears, almost ripping the player off the desk in my haste to shut it off. I didn't even know what to think anymore. I was scared out of my mind. Was it some sort of prank? Was this just some creepy hoax someone was playing on me? I stared at the tape on the desk, the last remnants of that laugh still ringing in my ears. The room felt too quiet now, suffocating. Every shadow felt like it was closing in around me. It wasn't until the next morning that I started thinking clearly again. I had to get rid of it. I threw the tape in the trash. It was gone. At least, that's what I thought. Later that day, when I got back to my car, the tape was back, right there, on the passenger seat, just waiting for me. I didn't know what to do anymore. I stood there in the hallway of my apartment, the knife cold in my hand, my heartbeat thudding in my chest. The laugh, it was unmistakable, had come from just outside my door. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The laugh was too perfect, too precise, too eerie. I had to be hearing things. But then it came again, soft, almost playful, like the person on the other side of the door was testing me. Do you believe in mercy? That voice. I knew it. It was the same voice from the tape. My legs went weak, and I almost dropped the knife. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry, and no sound came out. My mind raced. Could it be someone messing with me? Some sick prankster who'd somehow gotten his hands on the tape and now thought it would be funny to mess with my head? But why was he here? How did he know where I lived? I backed away from the door, pressing my back against the wall. The apartment was silent again, but the air felt thick, too thick, like the whole place was holding its breath. Every inch of me screamed to bolt out the window, to run, but something kept me rooted to the spot, a mix of fear and morbid curiosity. I couldn't stop thinking about the tape, the woman's screams, the man's laughter. What if this wasn't some sick joke? What if this was real? I crept back to the door, slowly, careful not to make a sound. My fingers hovered over the deadbolt, but I hesitated. What if I opened the door and found no one there? Or worse, what if I found someone? The thought of seeing that smile again, the one I'd heard through the tape, so full of malice, sent a chill down my spine. I put my ear against the door. Silence. Then another knock. This time, harder, more urgent. Please, please stop. I froze. The voice was distorted, strained. It wasn't just a recording now. It sounded real. It sounded like someone was on the other side, begging for their life. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a surge of panic. I could barely breathe, my chest tightening. The knife slipped from my hand and clattered to the floor, breaking the silence like a gunshot. I stepped back, my heart pounding, my legs weak. Every instinct told me to run, but my body wouldn't move. Instead, I grabbed my phone from my pocket and dialed 911, my fingers shaking as I hit the numbers. The dial tone seemed to echo forever. Just as I was about to speak to the operator, the voice came again. Are you alone? I froze. It wasn't coming from the door. It wasn't coming from anywhere outside. It was coming from behind me. I whipped around, my stomach flipping, but there was no one there. Just my dark apartment, the dim glow of the streetlights outside, filtering through the blinds. Then it clicked. The voice, the laughter. It wasn't on the tape anymore. It was here. I stumbled backward, almost tripping over the coffee table, my mind racing. What the hell was going on? Had someone been inside while I wasn't paying attention? Was there someone hiding in my apartment right now, watching me? I couldn't take it. I bolted for the door, pulled open the peephole again, and for the first time, I saw something. There was no one standing there, but there was something on the floor. A small square package, wrapped in plain brown paper, placed perfectly in the middle of the hallway. It wasn't there before. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at it through the peephole. The same cold feeling that had crawled up my spine earlier surged again. Every part of me screamed to ignore it, to just walk away, but I couldn't. I wasn't sure if it was the fear or the morbid curiosity, but I knew I had to open the door. I unbolted it slowly. Every creak of the hinges felt like a countdown to something awful. I opened the door just enough to reach the package. My hand was shaking as I picked it up. It felt strange in my hands, heavier than it should have been for its size. I stared at it for a moment, wondering if I should tear it open. What if it was a bomb, or worse? But I couldn't stop myself. I ripped the paper off, revealing a small black box. like something you'd find in an old record player or a vintage camera. I turned it over. There was a small label on the bottom that read, "For you, from me." There was no return address, just that message. I didn't know who me was, but I had a feeling it wasn't anyone I'd want to meet. Inside the box was another tape, the same kind of plain cassette I had found earlier. My blood ran cold. Was this a message? Was it some sick game? I wanted to throw it out, to burn it, but I couldn't. I couldn't let go of it. My fingers trembled as I held it, and I knew I had to know what was on it. But I couldn't do it here. I couldn't listen to it in my apartment, not after everything that had already happened. I locked the door again and rushed to the car, barely able to see through the fog in my mind. I tossed the tape onto the passenger seat, started the engine, and drove to the only place I could think of, a 24-hour convenience store near my building. The clerk looked at me like I was crazy when I barged in and demanded to know if they had a cassette player, but I didn't care. He handed me one of those old, portable cassette players from behind the counter. I handed him a few bills, then rushed back to the car. I set the player on the passenger seat, slipped the tape in, and pressed play. For a moment, there was only static. Then I heard it, the same distorted voice, now more frantic, almost pleading. "Don't do this. Please, don't." It wasn't the voice of the man who had been laughing before. It was her, the woman from the previous tape. I didn't even need to hear her to know. I had heard enough to know what was coming. The tape cut off. Then, after a long moment, came that laugh. And this time, it was louder. It filled the car, the whole parking lot. It rattled my bones, vibrating my skull. But this time it was different. The laugh wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, like the air around me had changed, like something was standing right next to me, breathing in my ear. I whipped my head around, but there was no one there. The parking lot was empty. The streetlights flickered overhead. I was alone, but I didn't feel alone. That laugh, it wasn't just a recording anymore. I had heard it, and now it had heard me. I don't know how to explain it, but I'm sure of one thing. It's not over. It's just beginning. The laugh lingered in my ears, even after the tape stopped. It wasn't just the sound anymore. It was a feeling, a weight. It was like it had crawled inside my head, taking up space, eating away at my sanity, inch by inch. I stared at the tape player in my hands, my fingers numb, but I couldn't make myself turn it off. The car was too quiet, the kind of silence that feels like a warning. The hum of the engine seemed too soft against the ringing in my ears, the leftover echo of that laugh like a vibration in my skull. I gripped the wheel tighter. The voice from the tape wasn't gone. It wasn't gone. I tried to convince myself I was just losing my mind, that maybe it was all just a cruel joke, a twisted prank someone had set up. But I couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in my gut. It had gone from something creepy to something real. Too real. I needed to do something. I needed to figure out who was behind this. I turned the car around and drove back to my apartment, feeling like I was being watched every second. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror every time a car passed. I hated how the streets felt so empty now. I had never thought much of the city I lived in before, but now it felt like a maze, like something was just waiting for me to make the wrong turn. When I got home, I bolted the door and locked every window, but the knots in my stomach wouldn't loosen. I felt off. There was one more thing I hadn't thought about until that moment. The phone. I still had it in my pocket, and I hadn't checked it since I left the convenience store. I pulled it out and unlocked the screen. Nothing. No missed calls, no texts. But there was something else. Something new. A notification. It was from an unknown number. I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening. It wasn't a text, just a missed call. And there was a voicemail. I didn't know why I did it, but I clicked the voicemail anyway. The first thing I heard was the same low hum I'd heard on the tape. Static, broken, and erratic. Then, "Are you listening?" It was him. The laughing man. His voice was colder now, more distant, like he was in the next room, or even in the room with me. His voice somehow penetrating the walls of my apartment. "Do you feel it?" he asked, his words slithering like a snake. "The weight of your choices?" I gripped the phone tighter, my hands slick with sweat. His voice was mocking, almost playful, as if he was enjoying my fear. "You thought you could just play with the tape, didn't you? Play with fire and not get burned. But now you know, don't you? I can hear you. I can hear your heartbeat in time with mine. I didn't even realize it, but my chest was tight, my breath shallow. I was panicking, my body reacting before my mind could catch up. The laughing man wasn't just a name anymore. He wasn't just some urban legend. He was real, and I had opened the door for him. The voice on the phone didn't stop. "You know, I've been following you. I've been watching you for a while now. Don't you remember me?" I felt like I was going to pass out. I wanted to slam the phone down, to rip it to pieces, but my hand froze. His words dug into my brain, deeper than I wanted them to. "Maybe I'll come visit soon. I'll bring a friend. We'll see if you're still laughing then." The line went dead. The static still buzzed in my ears, like the voice was lingering, just out of reach, waiting for me to say something, anything. I didn't know how long I sat there, holding the phone in my trembling hand. But I knew one thing. He had been in my apartment. The way he spoke, it wasn't a threat. It was a promise. I didn't know what to do. Call the cops? But what would I tell them? "Hey, a serial killer is sending me tapes of his victims." They'd think I was losing it. The tapes were real, but the rest of it, the phone calls, the things he said, I didn't know what to believe anymore. I sat in the dark, my mind racing. That laugh, it was in my head now, all the time. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it, echoing in the silence of my apartment. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence. I tried to distract myself, throwing myself into work the next day. I told myself that if I just kept busy, I could forget about the tape, about the voice on the phone. But I couldn't. Every time I walked down the hall, every time I glanced at the elevator doors, I half expected him to be there. At one point, I looked at the clock. 12:03 p.m. I don't know why I remember it, but it's burned into my mind. I walked out of the office for lunch, just trying to clear my head. But as I stepped out onto the street, I got another call. I glanced at the screen. No name, no number. But this time, I didn't hesitate. I answered it. "Hello?" I tried to sound calm, but my voice was shaking. Silence. I waited for the laugh. I waited for the taunting voice, the hymn I had been hearing in my head for days. But nothing came. Then, just when I was about to hang up, I heard it. A low whisper, barely audible, but clear enough to make my blood run cold. "Look up." I froze. I didn't want to look up. I didn't want to know. But I couldn't help myself. I turned my head slowly, and that's when I saw him. Standing across the street, under the dim glow of a streetlight, was a figure. His face was obscured by shadows, but I could make out his outline, the silhouette of a man, tall and broad, standing perfectly still. And I knew it was him, the man who had been laughing in the tape, the voice on the phone. He didn't move. He didn't have to. I could feel him looking at me, watching me. I swallowed hard, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. He didn't speak. He didn't laugh. He just stood there, like he was waiting for me to make my next move. I didn't know how long I stood there, locked in place, but finally, I turned and ran. I didn't care who saw me. I didn't care about anything except getting away from that man. But as I sprinted back to my building, my phone buzzed again. A new voicemail. I was too scared to check it, but I knew deep down that whatever it wasn't going to let me go. Not until I played the game. I didn't check the voicemail right away. I couldn't. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold on to my phone. But it was almost like a compulsion, the same sick curiosity that kept me from tossing the tape in the trash when I first found it. The thing that kept me watching the messages, the thing that wouldn't let me walk away. I couldn't outrun it. I couldn't escape the feeling that he was watching, waiting for me to make the next move. I was back at my apartment by the time the voicemail had lingered on my screen for long enough to make me snap. I knew that if I didn't check it now, I'd be staring at it all night, convinced it held the key to whatever this nightmare was. I opened it. The voice on the other end was quieter this time, almost whispered, "You're getting good at this." I felt my stomach drop. My heart hammered against my chest like it wanted to burst out. How did he know? What the hell did he mean? But then the whisper continued, even lower, like he was standing right behind me. "You don't know who I am yet, but you will. We're almost there. Almost done." I didn't want to hear any more. I didn't want to be there, whatever there meant. But the words stuck with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Almost done. What did he mean by that? The call clicked off. Silence. I stood there in the middle of my apartment, frozen. The room felt like it was closing in around me, suffocating. The walls seemed too close, too real. The shadows felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was here. Not just outside, but inside. Maybe he'd been inside all along, like he had planted himself in my life, piece by piece, until I was so wrapped up in his game that I couldn't escape. The laughter, the sound of it, started creeping back into my head. At first, it was distant, like the noise from the tape, just a faint murmur in the background. But then it started to feel real again. I could almost hear it in my apartment. I could almost feel the air shift every time I heard that unmistakable laugh, like someone was watching me from the other side of the room, waiting for the right moment to pounce. I tried to do what I could to shake it off. I kept the lights on. I stayed close to the windows, watching the street below. There was no sign of him, no shadow lurking in the alley, no figure waiting for me to slip up. But that only made it worse, the not knowing. That night, as I sat on the couch, staring at the wall, I heard a knock at the door. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat. There was no mistaking it. That sound, that knock. It was the same rhythm I'd heard on the tape. Knock, knock, knock. The world around me narrowed. My eyes darted to the door. I couldn't move. My limbs were heavy, my mind racing. I didn't want to answer it. I couldn't answer it. The door was a boundary now. If I opened it, I was giving in. I was stepping into whatever twisted game he wanted me to play. The knock came again, and this time it was louder, more insistent. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, my phone, and bolted for the closet. I slammed the door shut, my back pressed against the cold wall, the phone screen glowing dimly in my trembling hands. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just ignore it. I couldn't hide. I was already part of this. But then, something changed. I don't know if it was the adrenaline or the fear, but something snapped inside me. I opened the voicemail again. This time, it wasn't the same quiet whisper. The voice was low, but it was clear and cutting. "Let's make this fun." The words felt like they'd been carved into my bones, deep and sharp. I wasn't sure whether to scream or cry. "Open the door. I'm waiting for you." I could feel the air shift, a cold draft crawling under the door, swirling around my feet. It felt like fingers, cold fingers, brushing the back of my neck. I tried to breathe, tried to steady myself, but the panic was crawling in my veins now, thick and consuming. The laugh that had been chasing me for so long. It came again, but this time, it wasn't just in my head. It was coming from everywhere, from behind the walls, from under the floorboards, from the corners of the room. It was real, filling up the space until it felt like I couldn't breathe anymore. I ran out of the closet. I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't just sit here, waiting for whatever was going to happen. I burst out the front door, barely even registering the fact that I had just stepped into the hallway. I didn't care about the stairs. I didn't care about anything. All I could do was run. I reached the elevator. I hit the button frantically, pacing back and forth, but the door didn't open. I waited, but nothing happened. The sound of the laugh was louder now. It wasn't just echoing anymore. It was surrounding me. It was in my bones, in my blood. I had to get out. I turned and ran for the stairs. My feet slammed down the metal steps, each thud reverberating through my whole body. I couldn't stop myself. I couldn't get away fast enough. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself outside in the cold air, gasping for breath. I turned around, expecting to see him, expecting to see the dark figure that had been haunting me since I first played the tape. But there was nothing, no one, just the empty street, the same normal, unassuming street. The noise in my head started to fade. The laugh, the voice, all of it seemed to disappear for a moment. The fog in my mind began to clear, and for the first time in days, I felt a brief, fleeting sense of calm. Maybe I had just imagined it. Maybe I had finally snapped, and everything was going to be okay. But then I checked my phone. The screen was filled with one missed call. The number was blocked. I opened the voicemail, my heart in my throat. Not yet, little one." And then, in a sickening whisper, the voice added, "You're not going anywhere. I'm in the game now, and I always finish what I start." The laugh followed, just like before, and this time, it didn't stop. It didn't stop because it was my laugh too. It was mine. The world around me stopped making sense. I stared at my phone screen, the words that flickered on the voicemail chilling me to my core. I'm in the game now, and I always finish what I start. It felt like time was moving in slow motion, like I was living in a nightmare that refused to let me wake up. The laugh, that sound, that insane guttural laugh, repeated in my head over and over again, louder now, drowning everything else out. Every shadow on the street, every flicker of light, every faint sound of passing cars. It was all connected to the laugh. It was mine. I couldn't process it. I couldn't wrap my head around it. The message was clear, but my mind couldn't connect the dots. How could he know? How could he know that I was hearing it too? That I was becoming part of whatever twisted game he had created? I felt the familiar coldness creeping up my spine, the sensation of someone watching me from the shadows. I turned around, heart racing, but there was no one behind me, just the empty street. And yet, I wasn't alone. There was something different about the world now, like the edges of reality had started to blur. Every footstep echoed too loudly. Every street light seemed to pulse with a sinister glow. The air felt thick, like it was pressing down on me, as if the weight of what was happening was too heavy to carry. My fingers trembled as I scrolled through the voicemail again, hoping that the first time had been a fluke, a mistake. But no, the same words hit me like a slap to the face. You're not going anywhere. I'm in the game now, and I always finish what I start. The laugh. Always there, creeping into my thoughts, becoming part of my own. I stood there, frozen in place, feeling like a puppet on a string. Every part of me screamed to run, to get away, but I couldn't. I couldn't move. Not now. Not when I realized, when I truly understood that this was the game, that I was part of it. I wasn't just being hunted anymore. I was being played. The next few minutes felt like hours. The laughter faded for a brief moment, then came back, louder, more insistent. It rattled my bones, dug into my brain. I had to do something. I had to figure out how to break free from this. But I didn't have the strength anymore. I felt like I was slipping away, sinking into the depths of whatever this nightmare was. It was then that I heard it. A knock. I spun around, but there was no one there. The street was empty, silent. But that knock, it was so real, so immediate. It reverberated in my bones. I didn't have to turn around to know it wasn't just in my head anymore. It was happening. Another knock, louder this time, and then a voice, cold, detached, but unmistakable. Open the door. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My body refused to move, but my legs took me forward anyway, as if they were working against my will, as if I wasn't the one making the choice. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was dread, pure dread. With trembling hands, I reached the door. My apartment was still a few floors up, but I was standing in front of it now, at the foot of the stairwell. The air around me felt colder. The laugh was louder. It was everywhere, filling the entire world. It was inside my chest. The door creaked open on its own. I didn't even remember unlocking it. I should have been panicking, running, screaming for help, but instead, there I was, standing in the threshold, staring into the darkness of the hallway. I stepped forward, the door slamming shut behind me. I didn't remember pushing it open. I didn't remember moving. The hallway stretched on, endless and empty. But it wasn't empty, was it? Not really. I could hear him. Every step I took seemed to make the walls bend inward. The hallway felt narrower now, like it was collapsing on me. Every flicker of the lights overhead seemed to stretch the darkness further. It was as if the space was becoming alive, feeding off my fear, feeding off my confusion. Then I saw it. At the end of the hallway, the door to my apartment, my own front door, was wide open. The shadows seemed to move around it, almost alive, like something was waiting for me inside. I could feel him. My chest tightened, my breath catching in my throat. The laugh had become a physical thing now, like it had attached itself to me, like it was riding the air, lingering in every corner of my apartment. I reached for my phone again, but when I looked down, I noticed that there was a new message. It was from an unknown number. I opened it. You didn't think you could just leave, did you? I closed my eyes for a second. I couldn't breathe. You've always been part of this. The game has always been yours to play. I looked up again, but something was different this time. The shadows in my apartment were no longer shadows. They had shape now. They had form. Dark figures, shapes, moved just beyond my sight, shifting in the periphery. I didn't know if I was seeing them, or if I was imagining them, but they were there. They were always there. And then, there he was, not on the other side of the door, but inside. I saw the shape of him standing in the doorway of my bedroom, his form twisted and wrong. The shadows weren't just shadows anymore. They were him. His face was obscured, but I could see his mouth, stretched wide, the edges curling up in that terrifying grin. The laughing man. And then, I understood. I understood everything. The tapes, the voicemail, the shadows, the laughter. It wasn't a game anymore. It was never a game. It was me. I had been part of it from the beginning. I was the game. His laughter rang out, deeper than I had ever heard it before. The room was closing in, the walls pressing together as his laughter filled my ears, my head, my entire body. I felt my own mouth curl into that same twisted grin, a laugh escaping my lips, but I couldn't stop it. I wasn't me anymore. I was the game, and it had only just begun.